Hola, bueno, buenos días de nuevo. El café se nos alarga después de 1 hora y media intensa de internacionalización, ¿verdad? Parece que necesitábamos un poco despejarnos. Bueno, buenos días a todos de nuevo. ¿No se oye? Sí, ahora sí. Bueno, es un placer para mí y un privilegio estar aquí junto a un ponente plenario que tuve la suerte de conocer ya hace unos cuantos años y que no necesita mucha presentación, la verdad, ya que sin duda es un referente para todos nosotros los que trabajamos en lenguas, sea cual sea el enfoque. Pues Brian es alguien conocido y que siempre estamos encantados de tenerle con nosotros. Thank you, Brian, for accepting the invitation of ACLES. We are really pleased to have you here. And I will mention some remarks about you, only there is no need, but there is always compulsory now. So Brian is a researcher and consultant to the Council of Europe. After developing the CEFR levels and descriptors in his PhD in Swiss National Science Foundation project, he co-authored the CEFR, the prototype European language portfolio, the CEFR manual for related assessment, and so on. So we can be 1 hour and a half telling things that we've been doing so about the CEFR. So today, he's going to talk about pioneering supporting innovation in language education, the CEFR companion volume. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Gracias, Cristina. Me encanta questa invitazione a Salamanca, verdaderamente. Espero que me entiende. Sí, vale. No estoy capaz de hacer toda una presentación en español, aunque el hecho que esta conferencia me ayuda mucho a recuperar un poquito de mi competencias en español, pero para evitar de hablar per la mitad del tiempo en italiano, cambio en inglés. Bueno, so in my presentation, this is the plan of the presentation, and because when you invited me 4 years ago, we talked a lot about mediation, this time I'm going to focus more on the action-oriented approach in the talk. And because one of the most important points about the CFR is that these different aspects should be considered holistically, that they interrelate with each other. They're not isolated things. So an action-oriented approach implies mediation and plurilingualism. Mediation implies action orientation and plurilingualism, etc. So, just to start off, a quick reminder of what the aims of the CFR project were, as is written in the 2001 book. There were two main aims on the one hand, to provide common reference points, and in particular to encourage constructive alignment, which is an expression that's been used a couple of times and which we'll explain more in a moment, but also, and in fact mainly, to stimulate reflection and reform, to encourage people, to invite people to consider relevant aspects, reflect on their current practice and ask themselves, does it make sense? But to look for a moment at constructive alignment in a bit more detail, it's quite interesting that this concept is the reference which is given for this concept is always Biggs 2003, which is pretty much simultaneous with the CFR. And the main point is that the teaching methods used and the assessment tasks are aligned with the learning activities which are assumed in the learning outcomes. The learning outcomes in our terminology are the descriptors. And so the idea is that the descriptors provide, on the one hand, the inspiration for the teaching methods, and on the other hand, and the tasks, and on the other hand, are a guide for the design of assessment tasks. And the constructive alignment is exactly the same as in the expression construction of meaning, which is focused on a lot in the CFR companion volume. So the idea is that learning does not happen by pouring content down learners' throats. It is something that learners have to create themselves, which is not a new idea, of course. And the CFR descriptors provide transparent outcomes. They help to show learners what they're aiming at, which I call signposting. And they inspire teachers to create tasks, and they provide at least a starting point for the development of criteria to assess the success or the degree of success in those tasks, and what you can generalize about the quality of the language that was used. A really important point to make is the idea that we should be thinking in terms of profiling. The reason why the CFR has so many different categories is to encourage people to profile. Sabine was saying earlier that it's quite common for us in a standard for the receptive skills, a higher standard to be expected in the receptive skills, listening and reading, than in the interactive or productive skills. And that back in 2001, we wrote that a framework including both horizontal and vertical dimensions, categories and levels, facilitates, first of all, the definition of partial objectives, like in intercomprehension, where you learn to just understand another language, and the recognition of uneven profiles and partial competences. So in one of the draft versions, in fact, the main draft version of the CFR, there was a needs profile published, which was taken from English for Special Purposes at the time. And what you see there is, in fact, the part which is black in the middle is the area of competence of the learner at the moment, and the grey area represents what they should be able to do for this particular job. So that would then be the specification to develop a specialized course for that individual. And in the CFR CV, there are two types of profiles which are provided. First of all is a needs profile, which is that same sort of thing. This is a fictional needs profile for CLIL in secondary, or at about 14 or 15 years old. So the idea of having all these scales is to use them for needs analysis, fundamentally, to get away from this idea of general English and to think about what do people actually need to do in the language, and then to what level do they need to be in those different things. And so to define, it's a starting point for the definition of a curriculum. You can also have a plurilingual proficiency profile. What is somebody's profile across languages? That's mine in about 2018. And as you can see, I'm very strong in reading and less so in writing. And the reason why there are so many scales, as I said, is to encourage people to develop differentiated profiles, either for needs analysis or for describing proficiency. And in the needs analysis, to identify what is relevant for the learners, and then secondly, to establish what level they need to have in that particular type of activity. We're all familiar with the book from 2001, although I have to say I did once do a presentation in Madrid to a group of language schools where I asked how many people know that the CFR is a book, and one person put his hand up. And I said, how many people know what color it is? And he took his hand down. It's also a book. The CFR CV is also a book. It's a book of 300 pages, which is a little bit off-putting, but it is like a telephone directory. You don't read a telephone directory. You don't read a reference document. The only part that you really need to read as a text, as a narrative text, is chapter 2, which explains the key aspects of the CFR, which is all of 18 pages, including pretty pictures. So it shouldn't really, it's not as overwhelming as it suggests. The main sort of aim of the CFR CV project was to try and restore the balance, in the sense that there was a tendency for people to over-associate the CFR with levels and assessment. And to remind everybody that the title actually contains a priority of importance: learning, teaching, and assessment, in that order. And also to further develop key CFR concepts. There is an extent to which people engage with the CFR in almost some kind of order of acquisition, like, you know, that chimera that we chased in the 1970s and early 80s in relation to second language acquisition. I mean, first of all, everybody sees the levels. Then they notice the descriptors. Then, because the descriptors are can-do, they think about tasks, which they then think are the same as task-based teaching, and most people stop there. Whereas, in fact, the action-oriented approach is radically different to the task-based approach, as I'll explain later. And people tend not to have noticed mediation very much, and not to have noticed plurilingualism. As late as 2007, at a forum which was held to take stock of progress in implementing the CFR, John Trim lamented that although the apparatus of the scales of descriptors and across all these categories provided a wonderful basis for a cross-curriculum approach to the teaching of languages and the encouragement of plurilingual profiles and competence, this was an approach which was still, unfortunately, waiting to happen. Since then, there has been a lot of progress, particularly since the so-called multilingual turn in 2014 to 15. A really important point is that despite the name, there was a lot of fighting about the name. The publications department wanted to call it, and also actually the education department at one point wanted to call it a second edition of the CFR. But in the end, we stuck with the title A Companion Volume, because already by this stage in 2020, the expression CFR Companion Volume had already acquired a certain currency. But as the CFR CV itself explains, this is not a guide to the CFR. It is the primary point of entry for anybody who is new to the CFR. And for most users will not need to refer back to the original CFR. But if you do want to refer back to the original CFR, then throughout the CFR CV, there are links which take you back to the relevant section of the 2001 text. So with this more user-friendly version, the Council of Europe was responding to complaints about the fact that the 2001 document was an extremely difficult read. And the most important point to make is that this version of the illustrative descriptors replaces the 2001 version of them. There have been a lot of changes made. It's a heuristic. It's not an answer to all of your problems. It's a reference work. It's not a standard to be picked up and applied without thinking about things. And that's something that's very important to remember. It's not prescriptive, it's descriptive. It provides the descriptors. They each have a rationale for each scale. The 2001 scales have been expanded a bit. There are new scales for phonology, mediation, online interaction, and plurilingualism, as I'm sure you're all aware. And there are also new scales for signing competencies, which were developed in another Swiss Science Research Foundation project, which was carried out in Zurich, especially for the CFR CV. And it has some useful appendices. Numbers 1, 2, 3 are giving the tables 1, 2, 3 from the original CFR. There's the writing assessment grid that comes from the 2009 manual for relating exam to the CFR. And then there are examples of the new descriptors for the 4 domains used by the CFR, which is the public, personal, occupational, and academic. One of the changes is to have got rid of finally the native speaker. There's been a lot of persistent and almost deliberate misunderstanding about the idea that the native speaker was the ultimate aim of the learning a language, or that C2 is equivalent to the native speaker, even though it's stated very categorically in the 2001 edition that this is not the case. There were, in fact, only 13 descriptors in the CFR 2001 which even mentioned the native speaker, and they were all about accommodation on the part of the native speaker to the fact that they were talking to a person who was not a native speaker. It was not talking about the learner's language at all. It was talking about the behavior of a native speaker in relation to the learner. The new phonology scale moves away from the native speaker norm and adopting intelligibility as its guide, and accepting that everybody is going to, well, almost. There are a few people who manage to get rid of their accent, but basically learners are aiming to sound like Macron. They're not aiming to be perfect, they're aiming to be articulate and intelligible. And you don't have to deny your origins and identity in speaking a different language. If you're not aware of the fact, we have recently just done a pretty substantial update of the CFR website around the end of last year and beginning of this year, and I'm just going to give you a very quick zoom through it. To avoid wasting time, I'm just doing it with a few slides, and I'll leave you to explore it later, but you might like to write down the shortcut to the site. So the structure is as a home, then there's the framework, news and events, key concepts, descriptors, ideas for implementation, and resources. On the right-hand side of the homepage, and in lots of places, you'll find the CFR Online, which is the CFR CV 2020, the various translations which have made it as far as the website. There are already 13 translations, and 8 of these are on the website. And at the bottom, there is an Excel. You can download an Excel which has all the descriptors in 6 languages. So in English, French, German, Italian, Spanish. I think that's it. It's mainly organized around the key concepts, the descriptors, and ideas for implementation. And there are some video explainers, very short video capsule, in English, video clips, to explain the various key concepts like mediation, plurilingualism, action orientation. There are, in the news and events, there is all of the workshops which we have carried out over the last 2.5 years. The materials from those workshops are all available there. The videos edited and the workshop materials, the handouts, etc., etc. It's all very useful teacher training material. And then if we move on to the framework, that's the more familiar, you can't read it, but it's the more familiar thing about where the framework comes from, what the levels are, the illustrations of the levels that are available for reading and listening and reading, for written production and spoken production, the history of the whole thing, it's all there. And then the key concepts, which are transparency and coherence, which was actually the title of the 1991 Rüstlichen Symposium, which recommended the CFR, transparency and coherence in objectives for language learning in Europe. The user as a social agent, the action-oriented approach, plurilingualism and pluriculturalism, mediation, online interaction, and phonological competence. For each of these key aspects, there are synthesis documents. There's a 50-word web doc, then there's a 1,000-word extension, which you can read if you want to, where it says read more. And then there are a collection of articles, videos, various materials. The descriptors, as I said, are available in 6 languages. And then if we move to ideas for implementation, these are organized under course planning, classroom teaching, and assessment. Those 3, plus at the end projects, which is mainly related ECML projects. And the classroom teaching, the entries are all organized in relation to the key concepts of the CFR, like transparency and coherence, learner as social agent, action, orientation, plurilingualism, etc. Then assessment, there's a split between classroom assessment and tests and examinations, and that part, the tests and examinations part, has stayed exactly the same. It has just been moved. Finally, in terms of ideas for implementation, under the news and events, there is a publication enriching 21st language education, the CFR companion volume in practice, which came from a series, which publishes a series of case studies on implementing the the TheCFR companion volume or aspects of it. And this can be found in two ways. As I said, it's on the News and Events tab, where you can download it for free. And also, if you go to the part Resources, which has not yet, this part has not yet been reorganized, so it's out of date. But if you go there and you look at, under Resources, Resources for Implementation, then you'll see this work. So that was a quick zoom through what it is and what's available. So now I'd just like to take a step back for a minute and echoing a little bit of the discussion in the last in the round table. But first, just to recap where we are, the CFR, if you look at the left, the big box on the left, reception is basically listening and reading, with also watching videos, etc. Or signs, obviously watching signing if you're a signer rather than a speaker. And production is basically speaking and writing. And so before the CFR, everybody thought in terms of the four skills: listening, reading, speaking, and writing. And with the idea of a speaker-hearer and channels and conduits of communication. I speak, you hear. You speak, I hear. Bump, 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 ping pong. And this is a model which is from 1961 by a guy called Robert Lado, which was brilliant in its day, but because at that stage there wasn't even any applied linguistics at all. Linguistics consisted of, everybody was into transformational grammar. There wasn't any applied linguistics yet. So this guy, Robert Lado, thought up this scheme in a book called Language Testing, which was published in 1961. And the other elements were grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. And sadly to say, 50 years, or it's 50, yes, 50 years, 60 years later, 60 years later, a lot of people are still operating on that model. And the CFR is an attempt to move things forwards. In 2001, the aspect that was noticed most is interaction, where one was thinking of the learner as a participant rather than just a speaker-hearer. So thinking of things more top-down, from more of a discourse point of view, rather than bottom-up, from sort of sentence grammar, traditional linguistics point of view. And the emphasis was on the social use of language. Mediation was mentioned, but mentioned very briefly. The entire entry for mediation in the CFR 2001 is less than 2 pages. There is 1 paragraph and 2 lists of possible activities. That's it. It's about 1.5 pages, which was mentioned. So, and the concept of the social agent was also introduced in the CFR 2001 in an extremely long sentence, which many people find they have to read about 5 times to understand. But the concept was there. And what the CFR CV does is to shift the emphasis onto the idea of the social agent with the co-construction of meaning, and that rather than, as in the older model, talking only about code, like seeing language as a code and counting mistakes in evaluation because the focus is on accuracy, or if you were lucky from the early 1980s on, balancing accuracy with fluency, following Chris Brumfitt and other people who were involved in the early Council of Europe projects. But it's about the learner mobilizing their linguistic resources in that language. And when we move to the CFR CV now, we're talking about language is a code, but the focus is on complexity as well as accuracy and fluency, the range and sophistication of the language which the learner is trying to use and acquire, rather than encouraging people to play safe and stick to things which they are close to their comfort zone and be completely accurate, to actually try and use more difficult language, more complex syntax, because this is the way you learn. And to do it, you need to read a lot, but the focus is on complexity as well as accuracy and fluency. So basically, this is a shift from a traditional linear view, seeing things as linear and monolingual, and a Cartesian view of chopping things up into little bits in order to analyze them and see them more clearly, and then put them back together again, which is essentially the way that linguistics was thought of in the 1960s. It's a move from that to learning to communicate and learning to communicate in class in order to speak later outside class. From that to a complex edition in which everything is seen as being complex, and that the aim is to learn to co-construct with others content and communication, and the class is seen as a real social context. So it's a move from simplicity to complexity. A lot of the problems we have in the world, there was discussion of climate change, and there's lots of things where the fundamental problem is that people think in terms of a simple if-then action result. You know, they think of a consequential result from any single action, when in fact everything is interconnected in reality, according to complexity theories, which started off in ecology and have now moved into all areas of the humanities as well as the hard sciences. So the idea is to embrace complexity and provide the scaffolding that's needed rather than dumbing down. One of the worst things that has ever happened to language learning, in my personal opinion, is simplified readers, because it encourages people to never try and read above their level. You should always be trying to read above your level. How else are you going to acquire a rich vocabulary if you don't read above your level and have a dictionary around? Then complexity of tasks with a multi-step approach, a challenge, and accepting complexity of language. So there is a tendency, there are a lot of courses where even in English, the past tense is not introduced until the second year. You know, whereas in English, the simple present and the simple past are really virtually identical. You just change do to did. It's only having to learn all of, you know, I mean, what time do you get up? What time did you get up? It's the same thing. I mean, it's only you having to learn all those horrible irregular verbs that makes it difficult. But there is a tendency to avoid making things complex for the learner, which is not always helpful. And fundamentally, there is no one-to-one relationship between words and meaning in a language. That has been called the language myth. And let alone across languages, we're aware of the fact that one language may have 3 or 4 concepts to explain what another language only has 1. In German, there's a word Tintenfisch. In Italian, they have about 7 words to describe different types of Tintenfisch. The Eskimos have, I don't know, 27, I think, different words for snow, the Inuit. As I was mentioning before, moving from a discrete analytic kind of chopping things up approach to a more holistic, situated, contextualized view of learning and integrated skills, which involves mediation. And finally, seeing people's language repertoire as a holistic and integrated thing which develops with their trajectory through life as they move from their home to primary school to secondary school to whatever, university or not, professional life, relationships they have. It's an expansion the whole time, unless they stay in exactly the same spot their entire life. And in that process, they acquire an expanding language repertoire in terms of varieties and registers and different languages. And this is what plurilingualism is all about, encouraging that process and encouraging people to go further with that process and to understand the other. So, moving on to the things in a little bit more detail, as I said, we'll focus a bit more on the action-oriented approach. And as I said, these 3 things should be thought of as interrelating rather than being seen in isolation. So action orientation, well, it was introduced in the CFR 2001. It obviously involves can-do descriptors, collaborative tasks, and there is a focus on interaction and on agency. And I think most people got that point. But in the last 20 years, on the one hand, there have been a lot of theoretical advances with ecological approaches and applications of complexity theory to language learning, the sociocultural theory, et cetera, has all developed. And it all aligns perfectly with the fundamental CFR message in the incredibly long sentence that was difficult to understand, which was written by Daniel Coste. And at the same time, there has been a lot of bottom-up experimentation by practitioners, particularly in France, because in some, in England, there has been a tendency to equate the action-oriented approach with the communicative approach, whereas right from the beginning in the French literature, there was an argument, and the only person who thought it was the same was Béarco, people like Puren and others, argued that it was a new approach because of the focus on perception and action that we will look at in a moment. But there has been a lot of bottom-up experimentation by practitioners in different contexts in ignorance of what each other were doing, and they've all come to the same sort of conclusions. And not just in relation to the CFR, because there's a whole thing in America called action-based teaching, which is the same thing, which was started off by Leo van Leer, who is one of the greatest, in my opinion, one of the greatest language teaching experts that we have ever had. So the CFR 2020, the companion volume, presents the action-oriented approach more explicitly and refines and broadens the vision. Very simply, it's transparency of objectives, real-life tasks, and strategic, autonomous decision-making. Those are the three key aspects of an action-oriented approach. You see the learners as social agents. This has been mentioned in lots of the presentations in the parallel sessions, acting together in collaboration with a mission to do something and complete a task. That they have the initiative. They have the initiative. They make the decisions. But they're forced to be creative by having conditions and constraints, like the amount of time they can take. If it's something about going somewhere or something, the amount of money they can spend, these sorts. And in which they develop strategies by trying and trying again, trial and error, developing ways of proceeding, and mobilizing all of their resources, cognitive, emotional, linguistic, cultural, and planning what they're doing, monitoring their progress, and seeing where they're getting to. So it's a continuous, iterative sort of process. And by performing in such complex tasks in which they act in the language, they further develop their competencies. They further mobilize and merge and develop their competencies. In the sense of, this is very much in line with a French view of the word compétence, where competence cannot be separated from action. Competence is the ability to essentially to operate your agency in agir. Then if we look at the word social agent, it has two components. The social agent is operating in a context. By the way, social agent, social actor, it's complicated. In French, it's acteur social. In English, it's social agent. The two terms in sociology mean almost the opposite in the two different languages. Both terms exist in both languages. But in English, the correct term is social agent for what we're talking about because of the focus on agency. There is traditionally no word for agency in French. There's just the verb agir. But people have started using the term agentivité. Anyway, social agents exert their agency, but it's within a specific situation which is defined by a range of conditions and constraints. So Halliday, the famous Australian linguist, he talked about meaning potential. He saw the meaning potential in the situation, rather than thinking about the competence of the person, like Chomsky or even Himes. He thought of what you can mean being defined by the situation that you're in. And this is the same sort of thing that Leo van Leer talks about and he even quotes Halliday when he talks about action potential. What is your potential for action in this situation? Are you dominated by the situation? Is someone else the boss and you are just sitting there being quiet? or can you actually act? And then, if you can act, you mobilize all of your resources, develop strategies, as I said, in iterative cycles, plan, produce results, and monitor your action as you go along. That is being an agent. An agency has 4 core characteristics in agency theory. Intentionality, you're doing it deliberately, and you adjust your plan in the light of new information. Just because you have a lesson plan doesn't mean you have to stick to the lesson plan. Just because you have a weekly, plan for your... the idea, there's no contradiction between having a plan and being spontaneous in deciding when to depart from that plan or revise it in the light of circumstances. It's still intentional. Forethought, considering what possible consequences could be, anticipating outcomes, anticipating difficulties, deciding what to do on the basis of your experience, so thinking about things. Self-regulatory processes, basically self-direction, thinking about what you're doing, that link thought to action. Self-reflection on, that is what we're doing makes sense. And all of this helps you to be successful, and it helps you to, the belief that you can be successful is called self-efficacy. This is a really, really important thing for particularly young people to acquire, the belief that they can be successful. But it needs to also be linked to being successful. So there are direct implications for the AOA. Learners need to engage, so they need to be motivated, so you have to have motivating tasks. So the tasks have to be relevant to the learners. Treating them as a social agent means putting them in a situation in which they would find themselves. It's impossible to exercise agency without knowing what you're doing, without having a particular direction, a particular concrete aim. And concrete aims in this respect operate much better than vague descriptions. Most curricula traditionally contain vague curricular aims, and whereas in a language course curriculum and in a syllabus, these need to be made more concrete, and the CFR descriptors help to do that. Then, as we said, competence is there shown when you can mobilize and combine everything, and the belief that you can be successful is strengthened by the experience of previous success. And learners will do things which are difficult if they know that they're not going to be judged first time. That if they know that they're going to be able to take several shots at this thing, then they will be braver. If they're scared of being corrected and judged immediately that they start to produce something, then they will not progress. So it's giving challenging tasks, providing the scaffolding, and encouraging the learners to try, and then to repeat, trial and error, and improve and produce different drafts. There's a quote here: "Conceptions are rarely transformed into masterful performance on the first attempt by anybody." And then learners learn to operate best in an iterative process of feed forward with the descriptors. This is what we're aiming at, and feedback. This is how we're doing. These are the mistakes we're making. We've gone in the wrong direction. We need to review what we've written here. It doesn't look very accurate. People ask, how is all of this different from the communicative approach? Well, there are a lot of points in common, which you can see there. Learning to use the language, meaningful stuff, real life, functions, authentic materials, pair work, some group work. Tasks, although they're different in scope. Well, looking at the tasks, here is a classic list of communicative tasks taken from Willis & Willis from their task generator: lists, ordering, sequencing, matching, comparing, sharing personal experience, problem solving, blah, blah. The only ones which are potentially action-oriented are the last two, because even sharing personal experience is aimless. It's like casual conversation. It's very valuable, but it's aimless. There is no aim except phatic communication, just getting to know each other. Unless it's embedded into some kind of a scenario where people's personal experiences are used as a basis to create something, as is the idea behind what was called Teaching Unplugged, which is a really good book. Teaching Unplugged, I'm afraid I can't remember the name of the authors, but it's early 1990s. If you were to Google Teaching Unplugged, it's a brilliant book based upon the idea of using your learners' personal experiences as the basis for your teaching. So I'm not saying you don't use personal experience. I'm just saying that if it's only getting people to talk about themselves, it's aimless. And in order for it to be action-oriented, there has to be a goal. There has to be a concrete goal that you are aiming towards. So that leaves us with problem-solving and projects. And even there, in the examples given by Willis and Willis, teachers orchestrate the project with precise instructions, saying students work in groups and choose the 5 best questions and answer them from the documentary, things like that. Whereas in action-oriented tasks and scenarios provide affordances. It's the learners who take responsibility and design what they're doing. The teacher asks about progress now and then. So the big differences are that in the AOA, tasks are expressed in real-life terms with can-do descriptors. There's student choice and agency. Normally, tasks will be organized in a sequence, which are knitted together with a realistic scenario for the students. But the important point is that the unit you're dealing with is across several lessons, not just one lesson. It's a didactic sequence. And they don't just provide practice of isolated skills or bits of language. They provide affordances that encourage an end product creating an artifact with transparent assessment related to the descriptors which were providing the goal. Affordances is a word I've used twice now, and I'll just do a little parenthesis to explain what affordances are, because it comes from phenomenology, which was mentioned yesterday by Laurent. Affordance theory is related to the ecological approach and a complexity, the application of complexity theories to language learning. Affordances are perceived as invitations that you perceive in the environment. They are opportunities for action. They can be, and there's a theory of creativity by a guy called Glavenau, the 5 A's theory of creativity, and one of the A's is affordances, which creativity can be defined as the process of perceiving, exploiting, and generating new affordances. So the idea is that you should turn from input-output metaphors because people act as they perceive, and they perceive as they act. And language is part of perception. Louis van Leer says this a little bit more comprehensively, talking about promote a learning environment with action potential and then encourage perception in action, which will help the students to see things. Perception in action. So instead of providing inputs, you should provide what has been called a rich landscape of performances, which will help foster the emergence of language and perception and intentionality. Perception, this has been back in the 1990, Schmidt wrote he did a PhD and then wrote an excellent article on noticing, consciousness in language learning. If you don't notice things, if you don't perceive things, then you tend not to learn as much. And the idea of all of this is to encourage students to take responsibility for what they're doing, and then they will tend to perceive things more and notice the language that they need to use. So how do we put all of this in practice? Well, action orientation is driven in 2 levels: course planning and then classroom enactment. At the planning level, it means planning backwards from learners' real-life communicative needs, and this has been called contrasted to forwards planning, central planning, and backwards planning by Jack Richards in 2013, and he refers specifically to the CEFR when he's talking about backwards planning, that you start from the end product, which is the descriptors, and then alignment between your planning, teaching, and assessment, that it's all working together, involving students, and using the descriptors to create concrete goals for particular tasks. And in the classroom then, purposeful collaborative tasks that allow the students initiative so that they can act strategically, exert their agency, have a defined mission, require co-construction of meaning of a group of students together through mediation in interaction under certain conditions and constraints, and probably you need to specify a language policy. Now, if you're in a philosophy of only one language, that's not a problem. But if you're taking a more plurilingual approach, you need to define when is it a free-for-all, and when are they supposed to use the target language? When are they? Is it, what's a really good idea in a school context in particular is to get the students to use the two different foreign languages that they're learning in different phases of the activity, as well as their mother tongue. So to summarize, backwards design to can-do outcomes, accepting complexity, scenarios, authenticity, affordances to stimulate creativity, agency to do different things, make decisions, research different sources, a pluri or intercultural approach with an integration of languages, co-construction of meaning, and feed-forward feedback leading to, hopefully, self-efficacy and therefore awareness with a self-assessment of outcomes. And Enrique Picardo and I wrote a book about it all, which is a bit theoretical, but nonetheless I would recommend to you. So to move to mediation, which I talked about more last time, it's the fourth of the four modes of communication. The categories for communicative language activities and for strategies are the same. Mediating communication is about creating space, managing tensions, etc. Mediating concepts is about co-constructing meaning at a social individual level. And then mediating text is all about reformulation, switching oral to written, changing genre, etc. And this can all be in one language or across languages. It can be, if it's across languages, it could be by alternating between the languages or by meshing the languages together. This leads to a process which is called languaging, in the sense that students are languaging as they think things through together in mediating concepts. They are languaging in the process of self-other regulation when they mediate communication. And when they're mediating a text, they are languaging in order to find formulations that the other people will understand. And there are all sorts of different types of competence which come into play during mediation: personal, interpersonal, intrapersonal competences. Those are the scales, which I guess you've all seen by now. Those are the mediation strategy scales. And an important point is that the language A, language B in the mediating a text can be different languages, different varieties, registers, modalities, or any combination of these. Or they can be identical. So in the companion volume, the idea of mediation, which I've gone over rather quickly, is to involves things like creating plurilingual, pluricultural space for communication and learning, reducing blocks and tensions, building bridges, co-constructing meaning, passing on information and acting as an intermediary. Not just being a technical conduit in a sort of a one-to-one relaying across languages of the contents of a text, like a Babel fish in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, for which there is now a commercial product which is called Pilot, which you can, as with the Babel fish in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you just stick the pilot in your ear and it automatically translates the language for you. This is a way, Geneviève Zerat wrote a pretty scathing criticism of the way in which mediation was presented in the CFR 2001, because it could be perceived in precisely this technical, content-free, culture-free way. And Kolb, Elizabeth Kolb, in her PhD 2016, has done an analysis of the way in which mediation is implemented in Germany, criticizing the lack of genuine contexts, the lack of treating the student as a social agent in the way in which it has been implemented in curricula and tests. On to plurilingualism quickly, and a lot of people stick with the term multilingualism all the time, but the CFR makes a very clear distinction that plurilingualism is about a dynamic and developing holistic repertoire of an individual. It is possible to be multilingual as a person by keeping your languages side by side. I mean, multilingualism, the word multi is an addition of elements, like multiplication. Whereas plurilingualism is a network with dynamic relationships, valuing and building plurality, considering similarities. A lot of people, particularly in the English-speaking world, stick with the expression multilingualism, but because they find it dissatisfactory because of this idea of things being side by side, they use an adjective like holistic. They talk about a dynamic model of multilingualism, holistic multilingualism, active multilingualism, inclusive multilingualism. All of those words are involved in plurilingualism, and they demonstrate the difference between the two terms. Just to give you an example, I mean, Sabina talked about the way in which Switzerland is a pretty plurilingual place. People are pretty plurilingual. The photo on the right, multilingualism, is a photo I took in Toronto, and it shows the way languages are treated in Canada, basically, where they are there, but they're separate. Whereas in a stroll along the lake, we spotted this takeaway stand, Baba's takeaway stand. And Baba's takeaway stand is really rather nice, because it says, Baba's Takeaway, nicht nur Takeaway, auch zum Mitnehmen und to go. So there is a playfulness. That's the point. There is a playfulness. It's engaging. It's encouraging. And he's deliberately mixing different. He hasn't actually got Zuriduch. No, which is surprising. Why is there no Zuriduch there, which you would expect? But anyway, it's an example of the way in which he's playing around across the boundaries of languages in an attractive way, whereas the other is boom, boom, boom. And that's, a picture says is worth more than 1,000 words, as they say. So, plurilingualism posits a single, integrated, holistic linguistic repertoire. It's also a methodology or a philosophy, an approach to language education across the curriculum. It involves the valorization of the full heritage, the full repertoire, so the home languages, heritage languages, plus an openness to the new additional languages, values partial competencies, and allows learners to mobilize all their resources. The key difference between plurilingualism and translanguaging, without getting into a one-week discussion, which we could easily do, is that translanguaging is focused on the valorization of heritage home languages. It is emerged from a bilingual context. It stops there. It's about normally two languages, normally the dominant language and the home language. It doesn't actually posit in the way that it is developed in North America by people like Garcia, and in Britain by people like Louet. It doesn't actually do very much in terms of openness to new languages and additional cultures and additional languages. And it doesn't get into things like partial competencies, but it does share the idea that people mobilize all of their resources. The last point. You probably can't read this, I shouldn't think, but anyway, in the definition of plurilingualism has not changed in 22 years, whereas the definition of translanguaging expands about every 2 or 3 years. So back in 2001, plurilingualism is introduced at the very beginning of the CFR with these points, which are just done as bullet points. And in the 2020 version, we present the way in which this relates to other terms which have been used about multiple language use. This comes from the book that we wrote. I won't get into all of that. You can look at it later. And we have therefore provided some scales on these different aspects of plurilingualism to encourage teachers to include something about plurilingualism in their planning for their class, alongside the CFR descriptors for all the other things, think a little bit about plurilingualism, what could the students at the level that they are and that they're aiming at, what could they perhaps be expected to learn to do in terms of being a plurilingual person? So what does all this mean for assessment, which I know is a point dear to a lot of your hearts? Well, there was a radical conceptual shift in assessment during the 1990s. I'm not sure if you can read this, but in the run-up to the CFR. And you see it in the title of books, like, well, there was a group called the Assessment Reform Group at Cambridge University, which ran for about 20 years. But the titles of the books, so, A Practical Guide to Alternative Assessment, that's American, Washington, 92. Beyond Testing, that's English, 94. Assessment for Learning, Beyond the Black Box. The black box is nobody knowing what a teacher is doing in their classroom. The black box is the classroom. Then inside the black box, raising standards through classroom assessment. And then finally with Briggs, who we saw before, aligning teaching and assessment to curriculum objectives, imaginative curriculum. Teaching methods and assessment tasks aligned with the learning activities. The descriptors being used to create tasks and to provide a basis for assessment. So what are the implications of the action-oriented approach, mediation, plurilingualism, etc.? Well, agency, learner initiative, planning, decision-making, scenarios, having a sequence of activities which are integrated together in which in the end they write something or produce something, collaborative co-construction of meaning through mediation, integration of skills, as I said, mediation of texts and concepts from different sources. It implies a plurality of sources. And I noticed it was very interesting that in the discussion of the adaptation of the CLES exam to a digital format done by Laurent and Annick yesterday, one of the difficulties was the fact that they have very sensibly give the students several texts as source texts, and that's quite difficult to do in a digit on screen, because it's much easier to look at 3 texts when they're on paper. And so for the moment, they've decided to keep that as giving them the 3 texts on paper. Recognition of presence of different languages, and then you have to say, okay, but when? You know, can they use different languages for source material? Can they discuss things in different languages? Or which language are they supposed to write in at the end for the product? And then the descriptors, you know, they help to guide the learner action and to develop criteria. So the challenges, all of that you can imagine in an informal atmosphere quite well, but in a formal atmosphere, it's more difficult. How feasible is it to allow learners agency in a test? How can you create something in a test? Who's the addressee anyway for this task? If you're going to have collaborative contribution, how are you going to rate the different contributions? How are you going to handle the group dominance? When you even having 2 learners in an interview, there is a problem of one learner dominating the conversation unless the interviewer does something about it. And how are you going to score things if you have integrated skills? And then on mediation, well, should we see mediation as a process that will, as a product? Should we assess it as the process as well as the product, or instead of the product, or should we assess both? And language policy, well, are they allowed to use more than one language? And how do the CFR descriptors help? Well, these are pretty big questions, and everybody is grappling with this. We saw the CLES, which was presented to us yesterday, is an extremely interesting example of an application of pretty much all of those principles. I was mind blown when they did that presentation yesterday. Here are some simple little answers, I mean, which really are rather inadequate, but it sets the ball rolling. Giving the learners the initiative, that they talk about their subject, their interests, their project. There can be a written dossier or a poster and presentation. Why does the test have to be a timed event that starts and finishes in the same place? Why can't they do something at home beforehand or at school beforehand? The context needs to be, as was mentioned, relevant to the social agent, putting them in a situation in which they would find themselves, so that what they do then is they don't do role play, they do what's called role enactment in English, which is a distinction made back in the 80s with role enacting simulations and scenarios, where you are yourself and you behave exactly as yourself in this situation. You don't pretend to have other people's character or opinions or anything, but you are just put into a realistic context to operate as yourself. Collaborative co-construction, allowing the students to choose the groups. Possibly you could have the receptive tasks done first with the students reporting input. You could give different texts on the same topic to the two learners, and then they have to report what they've got to each other in order to moving towards constructing something together. Joint grades are increasingly common at a university level, where students in coursework can be given a joint grade when two students do something together. Integration of skills. You can score each section separately, but then report a profile. Mediation descriptors could be used for assessing the process of mediation, whereas the more traditional competence descriptors are still more relevant perhaps for the outcome, the product. Obviously, you need to define your language policy, and the simplest thing to do to relate test results to the CFR descriptors is to, whatever the pass level is, use the CFR descriptor for that, and possibly use the CFR descriptor for the next level for being kind of, the maximum possible on this test, or more than the maximum possible, and the CFR level below, or plus level below, for the lowest score, or apart from a fail or whatever. And if you want to have more than 3 marks, 1, 2, 3, if you want to have points in this, basically norm reference around the standard. This is in fact what Cambridge do. They have a standard for each level, and then they norm reference around that. And it's not that complicated. 2 short examples at the very end now. Back in the process of writing the chapter on assessment in the CFR, I came across the ICC, the International Certificate Conference, Erasmus Stage 3, which was for entry to university, test done by Tony Fitzpatrick, who unfortunately is no longer with us. And this already was an extremely good example, nearly 30 years ago, of trying to move in this kind of direction, in that, there's a warm-up and there's an informal discussion and there's a telephone thing, which was very popular in those days. And then the floor is handed to the student, the candidate, and the candidate, there's a description. They describe their academic field and plans, and they've already written a report. These are the names of the CFR categories. They've already written a little paper about their field and what their research plans are, which they'd handed in. And so the questions that the interviewer asks are entirely genuine questions about what this student is saying. That the interviewer is asking the questions because they do not know the answers. It is real communication. And that is then followed by a goal-oriented cooperation, which was a collaborative consensus task. The French DALF works very much on that kind of a principle as well. The student is given a platform to talk about themselves and their work and their research, that sort of thing, rather than it being the interviewer who dominates the discourse. More recently, Austrian Certificate of Plurilingualism, 2015, which is very mediation-based, 2 phases. In the first phase, they present information there's information given in the learner's L1, or in German in this case, usually, which tends to be the results of a survey or something, which they have as a poster. And they have to present all of this to speakers of their L2 and L3, the 2 languages they are learning, which usually would be English and French, but might be English and Italian or English and Russian. And they have to explain all of this to the two teachers who are pretending not to understand German. And they have to alternate between French and English as they explain these different points to the two people. And then in the second phase, all three people together collaborate on developing a plan for a joint project. And there is a brief. It's a role enactment situation. Your school has decided to organize an exchange visit with, and these two people are the delegates from the two schools concerned, and together you're going to organize an exchange program. Away you go. That sort of thing. And there I've put the notes, sorry, the links for at the bottom of the slide. And there are also, they've developed a whole load of plurilingual lessons along these lines to encourage teachers to use this concept with their students, some of which require students to develop a dossier in 3 languages. Where are we with all of this? What do all the new descriptors and everything mean? I mean, basically they underline the CFR message. There's an attempt to broaden language education seriously. We're looking ahead. Nobody expects all this to happen tomorrow. The CFR in 2001 was a very forward-looking document. It's only since about 2015 that its true potential has been fully appreciated. The same thing will happen with the CFR CV. We don't expect, a revolution. The CFR CV attempts to bring the CFR up to date in relation to research in applied linguistics and related fields that have happened in the 20 years since the publication of the CFR. It will take time. People took a lot of time to digest the CFR. They will take a lot of time to digest the CFR CV. So we should see where we are in, say, 10 years in relation to the implementation of some of these concepts, because these concepts which are here are not unique to language education. These discussions are happening right across all disciplines. The expression action orientation is used in lots of disciplines, for example, particularly things like mathematics and design. There is quite a lot of teacher education material available, the simplest being CFR Chapter 2. It's 18 pages, it's got pretty pictures. It can be printed and given to people to read before a session. The website, as I mentioned, the case studies volume that I mentioned, and all the online workshops that we've done over the past 3 years, for which the materials are available on the website. There are some current initiatives that I'm aware of. As I said, there are 13 translations. We've mentioned the Austrian Certificate of Plurilingualism. In Israel, they've integrated mediation into the national curriculum. In the Netherlands, they're revising the national attainment targets for tests, integrating the descriptors from the companion volume, including mediation. In Spain, you know more than I do. There's been a certain amount of controversy, but that mediation has been integrated into attainment targets. In Finland, there's a new version of the ELP based on the companion volume. And in Italy, there's a whole network developing of teachers using some action-oriented scenarios in their classrooms in the 3 provinces of Lombardy, Lazio, and Campania, with about 150 teachers. So that's it. Watch this space, and thank you for your attention. And sorry for talking 15 minutes longer than I intended to.
So thank you very much, Brian. It's been wonderful. So I suppose there are questions now. We have time for questions, 15 minutes, so the floor is yours. So, Julia? Are there any microphones?
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. This was mentioned yesterday, and I would like to ask you for some advice on how to deal with the problem of reliability, or maybe not a problem with reliability, when we're trying to design meaningful tasks for assessment. Could you give us some advice on how to deal with that?
This relates to a question which came up at the end of the session on evaluation yesterday, which it is the question in language testing, which is that language testing has naturally been dominated by the desire to narrow down the construct so that you know exactly what it is that you're testing, and that makes life easier. And as you narrow down the concept to a very, very narrow construct, you get a longer measurement scale. And a longer measurement scale automatically gives you higher reliability. So this is why traditional language tests, if you think back, let's say, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, this is why they were very restricted. They were very discrete point, etc. And all of these items would be tested and retested and piloted and validated, etc. And the assessment scale gets longer and longer and longer, which separates people better, and it's a Cronbach alpha reliability, and you get a wonderful score of 0.9 something. The problem is that in the process of doing that, you remove all of the messiness of life and communication. So you basically remove the validity from your test. The more that you do this process, the more you remove the validity from your test. So this used to be called, a guy called Nick Underhill wrote a book called The Great Reliability-Validity Trade-off. You have to make a compromise between these two things, because nowadays reliability is seen as an aspect of validity. Obviously, it is an aspect of validity, and it should not be allowed to dominate validity, because reliability can be manipulated in all sorts of ways artificially. All you have to do is to get a few native speakers and a few pigs to take your test, and it automatically will increase the reliability miraculously, because the scale will be longer, so it will report a high reliability. So that means that any test which is going across a broad range of levels will automatically have a higher range of reliability than a test which is focused on one level. You have to accept that. You will not get reliability levels of 0.9 something if you have a test for B2 plus listening comprehension, because if everybody's more or less the same level, then they're not going to be separated as much, and this will report a lower reliability. So therefore, what you have to do is to take into account different elements which lead to lack of reliability. Things like obvious points about standardization of the administration of the test, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But ensuring the reliability of one has to make a compromise. One has to focus on the validity. You have to have what Cyril Weir has called, there's pre-validation and a priori and a posteriori, I can never pronounce that, validity. And one should have theory-based validity to design what you're doing, and then be sure that you have developed a reasonable construct. And then take, if we think of it's particularly a problem with the productive skills, think in terms of moderation systems. Moderation systems are the way that you increase reliability of subjective decision-making by markers and examiners. So that means training sessions, it means showing people samples of what it is, what level of performance you expect for a particular mark for your examination, etc. When you actually do the live examining, there are various moderation techniques, like double marking is the simplest everybody, or every seventh essay is double marked, so that you spot if one assessor is more strict than the other. Or another technique in a session in an institution is for the three or four examiners to all start off together and to assess 3 or 4 people together and then split up, because then you've standardized, you've reminded yourselves of the standard and the interpretation of the written criteria, and then you split up and away you go on your own. Because the problem with standardization training is that it's like ships passing in the night. You know, people are people with their opinions, and you bring them all together in a standardization session, and then they sort of go off again in different directions. I mean, standardization training does work. People do become better assessors through standardization training, unless they are someone who cannot do it. There are, unfortunately, some teachers who just cannot do it. But it doesn't last unless you've done it lots of times. If you've done it 3 or 4 times, then it begins to sink in. So there are no magic answers to this question. But the point is that validity is more important than reliability, because validity is having a test which is testing what you want it to test. Whereas if you chase too far after reliability, you end up with a test which is testing something else. Yeah. Yeah, I tend to agree, yes. I mean, these artificial, when you say to one group, right, you lot are arguing in favor of this proposition, and you lot are arguing against it, this is not, this isn't really, it's not allowing people to really engage with the task, because they're not able to engage their own reflection and opinions. It's very artificial. I mean, it's okay, it's a traditional debate, right? But it's much better if you actually are expressing things that you really think. So, yes, I agree. And that means that, that in a way, it suggests that the tasks involved should be more constructive in the sense of positive, you know, because that dichotomy you're describing comes from a sort of a for and against mentality. And where you have a task which is based on a for and against mentality, you're going to have that problem of who's going to argue against it, because all the students may agree that it's a good idea. So the way to avoid it is just to avoid those type of wonderful for and against arguments. They're very good for an essay, you know, classic B2 type essay, writing the arguments for and against a particular point. But it's difficult to realize in an oral situation, I think, unless you can know that there will be people on both sides. But if there are people on both sides, then you get into the problem that it may be actually rather polemic, particularly in today's, I mean, amazingly, increasingly globalized world. even though, okay, our students will all tend to be a little bit on pretty much the same plane, but still, you never know. You may tread on people's toes with too polemic a situation and, you know, cultural sensitivities and all this sort of thing. So I would suggest you just avoid those kinds of tasks and go more for the type of task where there is a given situation and it is your job to provide something in this situation in order to improve it, you know, and they argue amongst themselves and decide what they think is the best thing they can put forward, and then they put it together, they construct it and put it forward. That avoids the problem. But I agree, I admit, it is an avoidance strategy rather than a genuine solution to what you asked.
Okay, so thank you very much. And I think we'll finish now.